Hey, so today we're gonna make sourdough bread. I'm gonna walk you through a very detailed process from start to finish of the method and techniques I use to make sourdough bread. I started my sourdough journey or bread making journey about 4.5 years ago, and the recipe and techniques I use now are very different from when I started, just from all the things that I've learned over that time. And I'm excited to share them with you. There are many different ways to make sourdough bread, but this is what I use, and I hope you follow along and learn some things from me. And before we get started though, I wanted to go over the tools that we need to do this process that I'm gonna walk through. Really two categories: things that are must-haves and things that are just nice to have but could be substituted with things you might have lying around your kitchen. So let's start with the things that are must-haves. So the first one is a food scale. It's really important to measure out the ingredients you're using when you're making bread. I can't stress that enough. So you don't want to eyeball things. We want to use grams to measure things. And so it's very important that you buy a food scale. You can get them very cheap on Amazon or other retailers. I would highly recommend that you have this before you start. The second thing that is a must-have is a Dutch oven of some kind. So these two here, this one is from Target, I believe. It's a 7.5 quart Dutch oven. This one is from Challenger Bread. A Dutch oven helps trap steam while the bread is baking, and that's a must for making sourdough bread. There are other techniques you could do, like getting a baking steel or baking stone and then creating steam inside your oven with other methods, but I would highly recommend getting a Dutch oven because that's the easiest way to go about that. The third thing that is a must-have, of course, is flour. So you want to use unbleached flour, bread flour, or whole grain flour. A lot of times when I'm making a sourdough bread, I will use a mixture of bread flour and some kind of whole grain flour, like whole grain wheat or spelt or something else, or rye. But you can get by with just having bread flour too. That's completely fine, but obviously with baking bread, you need flour. The fourth thing that's a must-have is a sourdough starter. So if you don't have one of these already, you can check out my channel. I have a walkthrough of how to create a sourdough starter, full detailed walkthrough. You really want to have one of these before you start. And just to talk about this a little more, this is the typical activity cycle of a sourdough starter. The activity level can really vary based off your environment variables. So if it's really cold in your house or if it's really hot. So when you first feed your sourdough starter, the microbials are going to exponentially grow and then plateau for a while and then start dying. The ideal place to use your sourdough starter when you are baking bread is either at the very cusp of the plateau or on the plateau itself. So for me, as you can see, there's a lot of snow outside. My house is very cold. So I will typically start, or I will feed my sourdough starter at 9 o'clock the night before I plan to make bread. So that when I am making bread at around 10 a.m. the next day, the sourdough starter is at its peak as far as microbial activity and population, and I can use that and get good results with it. So that's something you want to figure out. You wouldn't want to use your sourdough starter when it's on the decline. So keep an eye on your sourdough starter and figure out when is this point in time that you can mix that into your bread. The fifth thing that's a must is a mixing bowl, of course. You want to have something to mix your flour and water into. Don't need to say too much about that. Okay, now we're entering into the territory of not required but nice to have. So the first one is a bread scraper, and this can help when you are shaping your dough or when you're wanting to clean the surface. This can be useful, but it is not required. There are other ways we can do that, and I'll go over those in the video. The next nice to have thing would be a bread lawn. These are used to score your sourdough right before you put it in the oven. And there's a lot of different styles of these. This one I believe I found on Amazon. This one is from Wire Monkey. If you don't have one of these, I'll go over in the video how to use something else temporarily or in the meantime to get that score on the bread. And the last thing is a bread basket or banneton. These are really nice to have, and this one happens to be from Challenger Breadware, but you can get them a lot of different places. This is what we use to proof the bread overnight once we have shaped it. Okay, so those are all the tools you need. Let's go over to the kitchen and start making some bread. So we're in the kitchen. Hopefully you have an apron or clothes you can put on that you're okay with getting flour or water on. This can get a little messy. Not saying that's gonna happen and you're gonna get messy, but you never know. It's better to be safe than sorry. We're gonna be using the Autolyse method to make this bread, and I'll explain more about why we use that method in just a minute. We're gonna be mixing the flour and the water first, well ahead of adding our starter or salt. And there's a lot of benefits to doing that. As far as the tools we need to start out with, we need our flour, a mixing bowl. This is a bucket of water, something to scoop the flour and water, and a food scale. If you have a notebook, if you're like me and you like to record things, I would recommend something like this. It's nice to be able to take notes on the process, especially as you start making more and more bread, trying different mixtures and hydration levels. It's good to notate what you liked and didn't like, and things that you observed during the process. It can be really helpful for learning and remembering things. So the first thing we're gonna do is put our mixing bowl on the food scale and grab our flour. I debated this for quite a long time, but today I'm going to be making a batch that will make 2 loaves of bread. And don't worry if you only want to make one. I'm gonna put the ingredients for one on the side here. It'll also be pretty simple. You can just divide everything I'm doing by half. But the reason why I want to make 2 is just to show you, 1, everything twice, and 2, I like to share my bread. I like to make a lot of bread at once and then share that out with people, friends and family. If no one wants it, I can always cut it up and put it in the freezer, and it's good to be thawed out and eaten too. So it's also great practice to make 2 loaves at a time. Doing everything twice can really help you form good techniques and learn from your mistakes, because if you make a mistake while you're making bread, it might be a while until you make another one. So being able to do things twice can be helpful. So for this, I'm going to be using 1,200 grams of flour total. 1,100 of those grams will be bread flour. 100 will be whole grain wheat. I would encourage you to try different mixtures of bread flour and some kind of whole grain, or even all whole grain if you want. That is a little different experience using 100% whole grain, I will say. But it's really fun to experiment. You never know, it could be your favorite type of bread. But what my house really likes is this mixture here, 1,100 grams of bread flour and 100 grams of whole grain flour. So we are going to be using 70% hydration today, and I'll explain what the hydration means in a little bit. But now I've got my 1,200 grams of flour in. The next part is adding the water, and this can be a very important part, especially when you're doing an Autolyse, and especially if you're in a cold climate like I am. In the intro you saw in the background there was snow. It's very cold here. The ambient temperature in my house is about 65 degrees, and for our microbial community in our starter, the ideal temperature is 84 degrees, with 70 being the very minimum for that to thrive in. And so as you can imagine, for me, that's difficult because everything around me in my house is trying its hardest to get that temperature down. So with the Autolyse, I will usually grab the warmest water I can get from my sink, which is 115 degrees. And you may be thinking that is extremely warm, but it's okay. And the reason why is because we are not adding our starter in where that high temperature matters for about an hour. When I add this in, this is going to keep this bread mixture nice and warm until that time. You know, when it comes time to add my starter in, this is going to be in the 90s or high 80s, which over time will help my fermentation thrive. So if you're in a climate where your house is, you know, in the mid 70s or 80s or higher, then you don't need to use this warm of water. You can use just room temperature water, like between 70 and 85, and your house or wherever you live is going to do work to keep that at a good temperature. The two biggest factors to making bread are time and temperature. And I just talked about the temperature, why that's important, but time is really where you build the flavor, you build a strong gluten network, dough strength. So having those two things are really important for making bread. So for this, I'm gonna add 800 grams of water. And you may be thinking, for those of you that do know about hydration, well, 800 grams and 1200 grams of flour, that's not 70%. What I'm accounting for in that percentage is the water and flour in my starter. So I'll explain those final numbers once we get to that point. But for now, we've got 1200 grams of flour in here, and I'm gonna add 800 grams of water. Just like I had mentioned with the flour mixture, experimenting with that, I would also recommend experimenting with hydration percentage as well, because that can really change the bread. And some people like really high hydration bread. I do. I mean, typically the bread I'm making is between 70 and 77%, which is considered high. I've gone as high as 86% before for my sourdough bread, and that was an interesting experience. But I haven't gone this low, but I think you can go down to 50%. So there are a lot of cool experiments you can do when you're making your bread in both the mixture of the flours you're using and the hydration percentage. Okay, so now this is the messy part. And I'll talk a little bit about the Autolyse while I'm doing this, but what you want to do is just get your hand in there and start mixing it up. And what we're looking for is just that the flour is fully integrated with the water. We're not kneading or anything like that. We're just kind of using our hand as a scooper and scooping along the sides and then mixing it together. And the reason we do this is because when we do an Autolyse, we are helping build gluten strength before we add in our salt or other components that can impact that. So as we let this flour fully hydrate with the water, it's building gluten strength, which is going to be really beneficial for our bread. And it releases enzymes that are helpful with things like extensibility or stretchiness. It helps slow the fermentation process down when we do add our little microbial dudes to this mix, and that can really help build a really full flavor in your bread. One thing you're gonna notice as you're doing this is the dough is really going to be sticking to your hands, and that's totally okay. And some of you are probably wondering, well, can I just use a stand mixer? Yes, absolutely you can. But if this is your first time making bread this way, or your first time using sourdough or sourdough starter or making bread, sourdough bread, I would recommend using your hands. Getting your hands messy and getting a feel for your dough can be really helpful for your bread making skills. And when you're making a small batch like this, it's really easy to use your hands. You know, if you're in a situation where you have to make 50 loaves of bread, of course you're gonna use a mixer. But while you have the opportunity to make a small batch in your home, I would recommend using your hands. So we're gonna mix this together until the flour, you wanna make sure all the flour on the sides is kind of scraped in. We want the mixture to be fully integrated together. We don't want any clumps of flour in the bowl anywhere. I've got a few clumps here, but you can see, I'm gonna tip the bowl over, and you can see it's kind of forming a little ball of dough, really shaggy, and that's okay. It's gonna be shaggy while we do this. But even so, you can see, look at that, it's already getting stronger. Just 5 minutes ago, this was flour from a jar in water. And look at the gluten already starting to strengthen. And it's gonna be really cool when we come back to this in about an hour and see how much this dough has strengthened during that time. It's quite amazing. There are other methods to doing sourdough bread that don't involve an Autolyse, but this has been something that I have really noticed a difference in when I'm using the Autolyse method. And I've been doing bread for 4.5 years now. I've tried so many different methods, and this is the one that I really like and I think works the best. So, but everyone's different and everyone likes certain things. The most important thing is that you're happy with the end result and it tastes good, and that you're making your own bread, because that's really important too. I don't know if you've gone to the grocery store recently and looked at the ingredients on the back of a loaf of bread, but there's a lot of stuff in there. And so once you get done with this process and you see that it's really just flour and water and some salt in your starter, you're gonna be really questioning what's in that grocery store bread. So yeah, you can see, look at that. Even after just 5 minutes of integrating this together, it's getting nice and strong. So this is fully mixed at this point for our Autolyse, that is. So I'm gonna set this aside. I'm gonna grab a kitchen towel. Well, first of all, I'm gonna wash my hands off. So excuse me a minute while I do that. And so, like I talked about, it's cold in my house. It won't always be that way, and once the summertime comes along, I am not going to need this hot of water. I can just use regular 84 degree temperature water or room temperature water, depending upon the day, and that will make my life a lot easier. But right now it is still very cold, and so I'm gonna put this somewhere warm so that when I go to add my starter, it's at a good temperature for those little dudes. And for me, the warmest place is actually right here, because there's a duct on the floor that is shooting up heat, and I'm gonna set this dough there and leave it there for an hour. If you're somewhere where you don't have to worry about the room temperature being cold, you can just leave this wherever you want, I guess. But I would recommend covering it to help it from not drying out. So I'm gonna set this here, and I'm gonna come back in an hour and check out where it's at, and we're gonna add in our other ingredients. It's gonna be really cool when we come back, because this, just from sitting there, you know, the magic of time this is going to be a much stronger dough than it is now. So I'll see you in an hour. Okay, so we're back. It's been a little over an hour since we started this Autolyse process. One thing you should note is that the time frames I'm giving you in this video are just guidelines, because a lot of times you don't have all day to do this and you might have other stuff going on. So you have to kind of work around your schedule. I would say with an Autolyse, the shortest amount of time you'd want to let pass would be 30 minutes. Once we get into the fermentation, you know, that's typically a multi-hour process, and that can also really vary based on your ambient temperature in your house. The important thing is to go back to that diagram I showed you of the lifespan of a sourdough starter. You want to make sure that when we put our bread into the fridge, that it's still at its peak and it's not in its decline. Time and temperature are important factors here, and this is something that you'll want to notate as you do your own bread to keep track of where things are at in your situation. So in case anyone was curious, I spent a lot of time talking about the temperature of my bread, and after the Autolyse, I had mentioned that I live somewhere where it's pretty cold, and so I start my Autolyse with 115 degree water, which is the maximum my sink can give me. And by the time my Autolyse is done and I'm ready to add my starter, right now I'm at 82 degrees, which is really good. 84 degrees would be ideal, but this is really good and I'll take it. So now to continue on with the bread making, we need two ingredients. We need our sourdough starter and some salt. Any kind of salts will work fine as long as you're measuring it. And so we need our food scale for that, because you want to make sure you have the right measurements of salt. As far as the amount of salt you want to put in here, that is typically between 2 and 2.5% of your flour. So when we're talking about baker's math, everything is relative to the flour. So when I say 2 to 2.5% of salt, in this case, 2.5% would be 30 grams. I'm gonna do 24 grams. What I found through experimentation is that 12 grams per batch for this dough really is what I like. Salt is very important to have. Without salt, it's a catastrophe. I've accidentally forgotten salt before, and the dough just continually loses strength over time as this just goes crazy feasting on that flour and water. It also adds a lot of flavor. Bread without salt, if you've ever tried it, tastes awful. So definitely make sure you have some salt. Any kind is okay as long as you measure. Okay, so we'll start with the salt. I would recommend either measuring with a cap or finding some small container to measure this in. You don't want to put too much salt in here, and it's easier if you measure it in a smaller container and then dump it in. So I'm going to measure out 24 grams of salt. If this were one batch, I would do 12 grams. Okay, so here's 24 grams of salt. Really not that much, but it makes a big difference. So I'm just gonna sprinkle this over the top. All right, and now we're gonna add our sourdough starter. And fun fact, this is actually the sourdough starter that I made with you in my previous video. This is day 9 of that starter, and I'm gonna use it for the first time in this batch of bread. My normal sourdough starter, who I affectionately call Jean-Luc after my favorite Star Trek captain, is on the bench for this one. So I'm going to be using this new sourdough starter that we made together in my previous video. Just a little fun fact. With the sourdough starter, you want to do 20% relative to the flour. So in this case, we have 1,200 grams of flour. We would want 240 grams of sourdough starter. So that's something you should think about the day before you're making bread, is how much sourdough starter am I gonna need for that batch? If I were doing one batch with this formula, it would be 120 grams because there'd be 600 grams of flour. So I'm gonna pour 240 grams of starter in here. And this starter is at its peak right now. It's very bubbly. I'm gonna dump this in here. So 240 grams. You can just dump it right on top of the salt and dough. All right, 245. So I poured 5 extra grams. That's okay. Now here's another messy part. So we're gonna take our fingers, and I have a bucket of water here. This is the same one from earlier today. And this is nice to have because once we get this integrated in, you might wanna dip your hand in the water to get it wet, because when you have wet hands, it makes it easier to work with the dough. So just take both of your hands and just start kind of grabbing it, poking holes in it. What we're trying to do is get that sourdough starter and salt integrated in with the dough. Just like before when we were doing the Autolyse, use one of your hands as a scraper to just scrape along the edges and work in that starter and salt into the dough. Ultimately, the goal here is that 1, we're working to build the dough strength, and 2, we're evenly mixing in that salt and starter. And so this process is definitely the most time-consuming process of this whole bread making adventure, and you really want to do this for about 10 to 15 minutes. You may have noticed that on my YouTube shorts, I do not have any videos of me doing this, because typically I'm either listening to music or doing something else while I'm doing this process. And so some people will listen to a podcast, listen to music, have a show on. I guess you could technically bring this with you somewhere, like on the couch or the table, and you don't have to be standing up to do it. Whatever helps you pass the time. And once you've got it fully mixed in by just kind of grabbing it and messing it around, you can start to pull it back towards yourself. So I'm just gonna tip the bowl here and see how this works out. But I'm just pulling it back. And then every once in a while you can grab it and fold it over onto itself and fold it again. What this is ultimately doing is, 1, helping the gluten network grow strong and getting that mixed in. So when you fold the dough over on each other, it helps integrate it as well. I personally find this process to be very relaxing. I have a very stressful job, and so this whole baking adventure for me the last 4.5 years has been really quite helpful for me, because it's very peaceful and relaxing to make bread. Also very mentally stimulating, because you can do so many different experiments with trying different mixtures and formulas. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, you can already see it's getting nice and strong. Almost to the point where, yeah, we got a little window frame there. That's good. It's starting to tear a little bit when I do that. But over time, this is going to get stronger. And actually, the first bread that was made in our house was like 4.5 years ago. I was looking back at pictures of that, and it wasn't me who made the first loaf of bread in our house, it was my wife. I was just so fascinated by that, and it tasted so good. I had to try it myself, and the rest is history. I mean, that I was addicted after the first time I tried it. And it's fun to look back at pictures of the first bread you make and then look back in time and through time to what you're making now. It's just completely different. And I hope that if you're making bread for the first time, you stick with it. Find a formula or a process that you really like. Hopefully it's this one, and you get enjoyment out of making bread as much as I do. So at this point, we still got some work to do, but my hands are not working with this dough as well as they were when I just added in the wet starter. So that's why I have this bucket of water here. I'm just gonna dip my hand in the water and keep going. And you'll notice when you do that, it gets so much easier. And the dough really starts to strengthen. I mean, hopefully when you're doing this yourself, you're noticing how strong this dough is getting just by doing this. So no real great way to explain how to do this except just getting your hands in there, folding it over each other, pulling it, I pull it and shake it a little bit and then fold it over. Some people just grab it and pull it towards themselves, flip it over. You just want to keep working with it for like 10 or 15 minutes. And going back to those time frames I was talking about earlier, not everyone can just dedicate their entire day to making bread. And so you got to work with time frames that work for you. And honestly, because of my job, I am lucky in that, I work from home, and if I take a break, I can go do my bread stuff on my break or my lunch break. But that might not always be the case for everyone, and depending upon the day, you might not have time to do things on your typical schedule that you had planned. Maybe something pops up at work and you don't take your break at the same time that you do on most days, or whatever. You have to go somewhere, you have an appointment. That's totally okay. I mean, it's pretty forgiving, but what I would say is that try and give your bread more time than less time. So if you had planned to wait an hour after this stage right here to do your first fold, which I'll talk about, but something comes up and it's going to be 2.5 hours until you can do your fold, that's totally okay. You can, your dough will not, your dough will be okay. But when you start to skimp on time, or instead of waiting longer and doing it shorter, that's when you can kind of get into trouble, because a big thing about sourdough is time. You want to give your starter or your little yeast friends time to do their thing and build flavor and ferment the bread. And so time is very important. And I would say that if you have to choose the longer time period than the shorter one. And so this whole process we're doing right now that we've added the starter and the salt, This is called bulk fermentation. So the first stage where we just added the water and flour, that was Autolyse. Now we're entering bulk fermentation. So once it's been about 10-15 minutes, which is coming up here, we're gonna cover this at room temperature, and then we're gonna leave it in bulk fermentation, and once in a while we're gonna do a fold, and I'll walk you through how to do that. But just so you can see, this dough is starting to look really nice. And what you're looking for is it starting to get really smooth and less shaggy. So when you lifted up your cover from your Autolyse just 10 minutes ago, you'll see that it was very shaggy dough. And I totally forgot to do this, but I wanted to show you how strong that dough was just from sitting on the Autolyse for an hour. So working with the dough with your hands and fingers is just increasing the strength. I hope you see that, you're seeing that in your dough as you work with it here. So my dough is starting to get really strong. You know, I can create a window pane already, and it's only gonna get stronger as the day goes on, which is really cool. I just love this, it's so cool. So once it's not shaggy anymore, that's typically when you can stop. And what I'll do is just kind of grab it, get it into a nice tight shape with my hands, and then set it back in the bowl. But I've got a couple minutes to go. I know what some of you are thinking, why don't I just fast forward through this part? But I decided when I was going to make this video that it would be a long form video, because one thing I've noticed nowadays is that people are in such a rush to do things, and especially when it comes to making recipe videos and other videos, everyone just wants the very quick overview of what it is, and no one really talks about the process or why we do things a certain way. And so I wanted to make this video so that I can talk about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and show you along the way. And making a video like this is kind of risky because I really only get one take. I can't, if I screw something up with this dough, you know, there's no rewinding that. I have to just go with it. And that's real life. I mean, mistakes happen. So all right, so this dough is getting pretty good, to quote Larry David. So I'm gonna just, using my hands, just kind of tightening this into like a ball, so to speak, and then putting the seams of that on the bottom in the bowl. So I'm going to talk a little bit about baker's math before we move on to letting this sit for a while. So I'm gonna wash my hands first. All right. So let's figure out our hydration percentage. So at the beginning I said that we were gonna aim for 70%. So just to write that out, I've got 1,200 grams of flour to start. I've got 800 grams of water to start. I had 240 grams of sourdough starter, which is half water, half flour. So I'm gonna add 120 grams to those two numbers. So plus 120, plus 120 grams, and the final result of adding that 120 grams each is 1320 grams and 920 grams. Now, some of you are probably doing that math in your head, but try doing math live on camera. It's not as easy. So I'm going to use my little calculator here. So 920 divided by 1320 is 69.6%. So 69.6%, if you factor in this water from us mixing this starter in and the folds we're going to do later, that's pretty close to 70%. So that's how you calculate the hydration level, is by doing this. So it's the water divided by the flour. And that's what baker's math is taking a percentage of the weight of the flour. So 70% hydration. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna let this sit for anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours. Like I said, 30 minutes would be like a really quick, really fast folding time. I would probably wait like an hour to 2 hours, which is what I'll do. Time is on your side when you're making bread. But like I said, that's not always real life. So wait like 30 to 2 hours and I'll see you back then. All right, so we're back. It's been about an hour and a half. I'm gonna do my first stretch and fold. And you don't have to take the temperature when you do this. I just, for those that are curious, mine is still at 81 degrees. So it's holding its temperature pretty good as it sits in there and ferments. So that is great. So the stretch and fold, why do we do this? From the moment we started with mixing the water and the flour during the Autolyse, gluten started forming and it's been strengthening. And if you think of it like a web, it's meshing itself together more and more as time goes on. And we want to help it out. So we want to help it get even stronger. And one way we do that is by folding it. The first thing you want to do is get your hands a little wet. Take one of your hands and just kind of run it along the perimeter of the bowl to loosen it up. Now, there's two ways you can do this. The first way, which is my preferred method, is to grab an end, lift it up so it's nice and stretchy, and slap it down to the other side. And then rotate the bowl. Do that with the next side. And then just keep going around in a circle. Now, the other way you can do that, and that's it, but that's the entire stretch and fold. Once I've finished with that, I can flip it over onto the seam side, and that's it for that. The other way you can do it, and some people will do it this way, is to lift it up and slap it down like that, and then grab it from the other side, lift it up, and fold it like that. So lift it and fold it. Now, whatever way works best for you is completely fine. I've done both ways many times, and the results have been pretty similar for both. So whatever you feel more comfortable with is what you want to do. Now that we've done the first stretch and fold, we're just going to put our kitchen towel back on, and we are going to let this sit for another 30 minutes to 2 hours and do another stretch and fold. And really we're going to do this 3 to 5 times. Typically I will do it about 4 times depending upon when I start my dough. let's set this aside and I'll see you for the next stretch and fold. All right, so we're back. It's been only about an hour or so since I've last did my stretch and fold, but that's okay. So here's my dough. There's some bubbles forming on the top. That's a sign of the yeast doing their job. So just gonna do one more. I'm just gonna do a quick stretch and fold. I'm gonna loosen it up from the sides, stretch it out, and fold it over itself. And just look at how strong that is getting. So cool. That's what we want to see. Just nice, strong dough. Just getting stronger over time. Just do one more example of the pick it up and fold it. All right, so we'll let this sit for another hour or 2 hours, and I'll see you at the next stretch and fold. All right, so we're at our final stretch and fold for the day. After we do this final stretch and fold, we're gonna let it rest for 30 minutes, and then we're gonna shape it and then put it in the fridge overnight. So just one more time, we'll scoop around the edges to get it detached from the bowl, and just do the stretch and fold it over, stretch and fold it over, stretch and fold it over. At this point in time, the dough should be getting very strong. So almost ready for us to shape. And one thing I forgot to mention is the reason we have to wait at least 30 minutes before we stretch and fold, if not longer, is because once we've worked with the dough and stretched it out, we have to let it rest. So that's the reason we wait 30 minutes or so, at least. In this case, I waited 2 hours because I was out on a walk. And the dough is looking pretty good though. So once 30 minutes is up, we're gonna shape this. We'll cut it into two loaves and then shape it, put it in the fridge. All right, we made it to the last step of the day. We are almost done for the day. This last step is called shaping the dough. And in this case, we have 2 loaves in this bowl. So we have to divide them out into equal parts. And so to do that, we're gonna use our food scale again, and we're gonna use a bread knife, or a bench scraper, excuse me. If you don't have one of these, you can just use a regular knife. That's totally fine. On this cutting board, I'm gonna put some bread flour. And the reason why I'm doing this is because this dough is very sticky. 70% is still considered a pretty high hydration percentage. And the higher hydration you use, the more sticky it is. Sticky and wobbly. This is some very sticky dough. And what I want to do is try my best to find what I would consider the middle of the dough. And once I've cut that in half, I'm going to place my bowl on the food scale. Make sure that it's, not completely lopsided. This dough was about 2,200 grams total, what we have right here. So maybe a little more than that, like 2,250, around that area. So we want the split to at least be 1,100 or in that range. Since we're just doing this at home, it's okay if it's not perfect. So I'm just going to take my bread knife or bench scraper and push down on the dough, and it should just cut very easily. You know, if you're using a knife, it's gonna cut very easily as well. And I can kind of use this to scrape it. If you don't have one of these, you can just pick it up, put some flour in your hands, that can make it a little easier. So I'm gonna weigh these out and see what I came out with. This one was 1,000, so I'm just gonna grab a little bit from that one, there we go. And set that here. So this next part is what's called shaping, and there are all sorts of ways to do this. I'll move this bowl out of the way. There are all sorts of ways to do this. You may have seen people online, or I should say, now that you know about this step, you will notice people online shaping their bread. And there are a lot of different ways to do it. The most important part is making sure that you're building tension in your final dough shape. So I'm gonna teach you the way I do it. You may not want to do it this way, you might want to do it a different way, but this is how I do it. I'm gonna be shaping these into batard or oval shapes for the bread basket, but I'll also talk about how to shape it into a bowl or a circle. So the first thing I want to do is put a little more flour down, grab this, and I try and make this a natural triangular shape. And what I'll do then is, once I have this triangle, I'll grab this end and fold it up. And then once I've folded that up, I'm gonna take the two corners of the triangle and pull them out and push them in here. So pull it out, push it in here. And then what you're left with is kind of a reverse triangle. So you grab these two ends and you push them in like this. Pull them out and push them in. Now, I'm gonna do that again with this loaf, just so you can see it again. But as you can see here, we have the shape of an oval, but that's not the shape we're gonna use in here. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna roll this out, or roll it up. And you wanna be careful, because as you can see, there's a gas bubble right here. There's two of them. You wanna be careful not to push those gas bubbles out. So I always get my hands nice and floury, and then I'll just gently fold it over like this, and then just kind of roll it up like that. And then I'll tuck under the sides, and then I will just move it along the board like this. And what this is doing is building a nice surface tension. And you can see that this is a nice oval shape. I am going to transport this into a bread basket, and this is going to be its final shape until I bake it. Now, you might be wondering, why do I have this rice flour on my table? Well, the rice flour is a nice way to protect the outside crust of your dough. So if you put the rice flour on, it acts as a nice barrier, and that's really important if you have a bread basket that doesn't have a linen. And there are times when you might want to do that. So these bread baskets have a cool textured shape. You may want to just put it in there without the linen, so you get that indentation on your bread. Maybe you're washing your linen. There are all sorts of reasons, or maybe you're using some other form of basket that doesn't have a linen with it. If you're using a linen, it doesn't matter so much. So what I was planning on doing is demonstrating the rice flour by putting one of these in a bread basket without rice flour, and then one in a bread basket with rice flour. So this one, I'll put rice flour on and just generously sprinkle it over the top, roll it up, And if you don't have a bench scraper, you can, very carefully use your hands, get underneath it. But the nice thing about the bench scraper is I can just scoop underneath it like that. And then I'm gonna put the bottom side here that doesn't have the rice flour pointing up. So I'm just gonna flip it into the bread basket like that. And then what I do is I just find the seams and I cross them over with a little hand stitch. If you don't see the seams or they're already integrated nice, you can just leave it. You don't have to do that. All right, so let's try that again. I'm gonna put a little table flour down. And I grab this one and I just kind of plop it until I get a triangular shape. It just, I don't know what it is, but it just kind of happens naturally for me to get that triangular shape, and I hope it does for you too, but it's never failed me. So I've got the triangle pointing the opposite direction this time, and I guess just for consistency I'll flip it around. So I'm going to take this bottom corner of the triangle and pull it up and in, and then I'm going to take the top corner, pull it out and in, and then this one out and in, and then I've got a new triangle here. So I'm going to take these bottom corners, pull them out and in, pull them out and in. And one thing you'll notice is that the higher hydration dough you have, the stickier these will be. So when you pull it and push it in, it's just going to stick. With lower hydration doughs, that's not going to happen as easily. And so you might see some people stitch them up a little bit before they roll it, kind of like that. And that's totally fine. Like I said, there's so many ways to do this. The important thing is that you're building up tension in your dough. So I've got this final shape here, or not final shape, but I've got this nice oval shape, and now I'm going to roll it. So I'm just going to pull it, roll it, roll it, roll it, tuck in the sides, and then pull on it on the board a little bit, just very gently, and you can see all the gas bubbles in there. So this one I'm not going to use rice flour. I'm just going to grab it and plop it down. This one does need to be stitched up, the seams on the bottom. There we go. All right, so now I've got my two bannetons full with these dough, and I just wanted to talk about other things you could use if you don't have a bread basket, because not everyone will have one of these when they first start making bread. But these are some things I found around my kitchen that you could use. Comparable to a bread basket would be like a loaf pan. If you have one of these lying around for banana bread or whatever else, you can make the same shape and put a linen down in there like this and plop it in there. That's one thing you could do, or anything similar to this shape. Another thing you could do is use a small bowl like this, and this one you wouldn't really be able to use this shape of dough, but what you could do is do the same technique where you're rolling it up and then you just roll it into a circle. So once you've got that final shape, just go through and roll it like a circle and put the seam side up in this bowl. Once you, of course, you want to put like a linen down in here and then do that. I also wanted to talk about, it's funny because you think of all these things once you stop recording that you should have talked about. One thing I wanted to mention about the step before this, the bulk fermentation, is that someone once asked me, well, is it possible to have my bread sitting out on the counter for too long? And the answer is yes. And again, it points back to the activity level of your starter. So many things about this process depend on you and your relationship with your starter as far as knowing where it's at. So the whole point of the bulk fermentation is to build up that gas as it's fermenting. The yeast is allowing the bread to rise, and all of the things that are going on in there eventually are going to stop. And it's important that when we put these in the fridge, we've gotten the most out of that process, but not too much. It's important to know that if you were to just leave your bread out overnight without touching it or slowing down that fermentation process, that gas and buildup and microbial activity in there is going to start dying, and that's going to impact your bread. So it's important to know where to draw the line for that, and usually that's a pretty long time. My dough, it's 6 o'clock right now almost, and I can't remember what time we started today. I think around 10 o'clock maybe, but it's been almost 8 hours since we started this whole process, but my dough still has a lot of life left in it. I can see the gas bubbles, forming, and they were bubbling up as I was about to start recording this video. So I could technically leave these out for a couple more hours, but if you're in a really hot climate, you might not want to leave them out that long. So, okay. Now the last thing we have to do is cover these, and there's 2 ways you can do that. You could use like a plastic bag. The idea here is you don't want these to dry out while they're in the fridge. Plastic bag is one option. Kitchen towel is another option. Honestly, I've had great success with just a regular kitchen towel like this, the same one I use to cover my dough bowl. You just put it over the top. There are companies out there that sell reusable bread basket covers. You could check out those, for a more sustainable option. But you want to cover it with something. That's very important, because if you leave it uncovered, your refrigerator is going to dry it out, suck the moisture out of there. What we'll do now is we'll cover these, put them in the fridge overnight, and we'll bake them tomorrow morning. In my case, I guess that is one good thing to talk about. How long can you leave these in the fridge? I typically leave mine in the fridge until the next morning. Yesterday, when I was baking loaves, I left them in the fridge until 4 p.m. on the same schedule that I'm on now. And they turned out great. And I actually watched an Instagram reel the other day of a baker who had to go somewhere, and they left their bread baskets in the fridge for 4 days, and they baked them and they turned out fine. So the answer is it depends, but I would try to bake them the following day is what I would recommend. Okay, so let's put these in the fridge, and next time I see you, we will be scoring and baking these and looking at the results. Good morning, everyone. We made it to day 2. I am super excited to bake this bread, and I'm excited for you, if you've gotten to this point, to bake your bread and see the results. I just wanted to talk about a couple things we need for today to bake our bread, and the first one is a Dutch oven. I talked a little bit about that in the intro, but any Dutch oven would work. One you can get at a local retailer, or the one I'm using today from Challenger Breadware. You want something that's going to trap the steam in your oven. I'm going to show you how to do that with a Dutch oven, and there are other methods to do that. Like I pointed out, you can use a baking steel and create steam in your oven with other methods, but the easiest way at home is to use a Dutch oven. I have my oven preheated to 450 degrees. One important thing is that when you're preheating your oven, to put your Dutch oven in there. So if I open this up, you can see my Dutch oven is in there. You want to let that heat up with your oven, and then once your oven's heated up, let your Dutch oven sit in there for at least 30 minutes before you use it to bake. That's very important because you want your Dutch oven to be at the same temperature as your oven so that when you put your bread in and close it, it's baking correctly and heat is radiating from the Dutch oven up through your bread. Now, a couple things that are helpful for this process of baking bread is parchment paper. If you don't have parchment paper, that's okay. You don't need it, but it is very helpful. Typically, you'd want just a strip about this size. This is a little longer than my actual bread loaf. And the point of this is to be able to lift up the loaf and transport it into and out of the Dutch oven. This is very helpful when you have a circular Dutch oven. You have to get kind of down in there to put the bread in. With the parchment paper, you can just simply set it in there. Same with this Challenger breadware bread oven. I can just simply transport it onto the bread oven. Now, I wanted to talk about scoring too before I got our dough out and we actually did it. There are a couple different tools you can use. The most preferred would be a razor blade, and that's essentially what these bread lambs are. So you see I've got 3 separate bread lambs that I brought out right now. There's 2 handheld and 1 longer arm extension one. These are essentially just holders for razor blades, and they help you score your bread. When you score your bread, you want to do what's called a functional score, and the easiest way to do that is with a razor blade or bread lamb. If you don't have one of those, if you don't have a razor blade or a bread lamb, it's okay. You can use a very sharp knife. Think of something similar to a razor blade. I think a serrated steak knife would be good for this too, but you want to be able to do that functional score. And the reason we do that functional score is because we want to create a weak spot on the surface of the bread dough so that when the heat is radiating through and the steam is being created, that dough has a nice intentional spot to burst through. If you don't score your bread's going to expand or burst in unexpected places. This is a way to control that. So it's very important to do this. There are a lot of different ways to score bread. The one consistent thing is the functional score. You may have seen my YouTube shorts where I do ornamental scoring, wheat stalks or cool designs. We're not gonna do that today. I'll make a separate video on doing that, but today we're just gonna do the functional score for our first loaf of bread. And so let's grab the bread out of the refrigerator. I will say one more thing before I do that. If you just have one Dutch oven and you made the 2 loaves, you just have to do one at a time. So I would leave the second loaf in your fridge until you're ready to bake it. You don't want to leave that sitting out at room temperature. So let's grab our first loaf. So I've got my first loaf here, and you can see that it has risen a little bit, and that tension has allowed it to fill in on the bread basket. It's not super crusty on the top, which is good. This will be the bottom of the loaf. And what we're going to do essentially is tip this over onto the parchment paper. Okay, so now that we've got this out of the fridge and our oven is preheated and our Dutch oven is preheated for at least 30 minutes, we can plop this onto the parchment paper. And this can be a little tricky. Typically what I do is I will just start by tipping it like this and just flopping it down like that and then lifting up. And that's why rice flour is important if you don't have a linen, because you can see there's no rice flour on here. This is the one I demonstrated without rice flour. There's no rice flour on this dough. The linen did a great job of preventing it from sticking. If you don't have the linen, that dough, and you don't put rice flour on, that dough is going to stick on the edges here. And that can be problematic when you're trying to tip it out, of course, and it can completely break the tension of your dough. So let's go through the score. So I'm going to demonstrate how to do a score. You don't want to overthink it. I like to think of it as kind of a very shallow curve. You want to start at the end and dig your razor blade in there and just with very even pressure, pull your razor blade across the bread. You don't want to continuously put more and more pressure. You just, once you get in there with your razor blade, you just want to use consistent pressure and just pull your arm back and let the razor blade do its job. So let's do that. So just pushing it down, and I'm just pulling my arm. And you can see that it's got a nice deep cut here. There's a spot right here where my razor blade, I'm just gonna touch that up, and that's all we need to do. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to transport this to my Dutch oven. I'm gonna move this stuff aside, and I'm gonna go grab a heat pad real quick and put that on this cutting board. And I'm also gonna grab 2 ice cubes. This step is optional. You don't have to do ice cubes, but it can help create more steam in your Dutch oven if you do it. All right, so I've got my heat pad down. I've got some ice cubes here. I've got my oven mitts. Very important for obvious reasons. You do not want to burn your hands. I'm gonna grab the Dutch oven out of the oven, and we're gonna transport the bread in, put 2 ice cubes down, and we're gonna set the timer for 30 minutes. So this is all gonna happen very quickly. So I'm gonna open my oven. And all Dutch ovens are very similar in that they're all designed to have a top that is removed. So take my oven mitts off and simply set this in my bread oven. I'm gonna take 2 ice cubes. I'm gonna put 1 on each side. Cover it up and put it back in the oven with the timer set for 30 minutes. I did that really fast. It's okay if you don't go that fast. So oven temperatures vary. 450 is a good starting point. You will see a lot of recipes use different oven temps. Some say to use 500, 540, 420. I really like 450. I feel that's what gives my bread the best bake. And that was the same case for my previous home oven. So this is a good starting point, I think, and you can always adjust this. The key right now is that our bread is baking in a covered Dutch oven for 30 minutes, and right now heat is radiating up into the bread, and that steam that's being created from the moisture in the bread and also our ice cubes is causing that to rise up and create a nice oven spring. After 30 minutes of covered baking time, we're going to remove the cover of our Dutch oven, let that cook for another 15 minutes or so. So let's check in on this once the 30 minutes is up. I wanted to really quickly touch on this style of Dutch oven. So I spent some time going over how we use the parchment paper and score it and transport it into the Challenger breadware oven, but I know a lot of people will have something like this, so I wanted to spend some time talking about that. This is the loaf that we had the rice flour on. You can see it here. It is still on the bread. It did not absorb. If you were to cover this loaf with table flour, for example, and put it in the bread basket, that would have absorbed into the bread. So I'm gonna cut this again, just starting at the base and then letting the razor do the job and just pulling my arm along to the end. So let me set this aside and show you what this looks like when you set this into a circular Dutch oven. Put my oven mitts on. You simply take the lid off, take your oven mitts off, and this is where it's really nice to have parchment paper, because you simply plop it inside like that and then put the lid on and bake it. So just wanted to touch on that just in case. All right, so it's been 30 minutes. I'm gonna take the lid off, and you can see that the bread has bursted where we have done the functional score. It's got a nice little belly there, and then it's got the ears, those are called ears, forming on the sides. When you lift your lid off, it might be white still. It really varies, but after 30 minutes, we want to bake this uncovered, so leave the cover off for another 15 minutes. But I will say that during that 15 minutes, start to watch it after about 10, because you don't want it to get burned. Like I had mentioned earlier, all ovens are different. If you're taking the temperature of your bread, the internal temperature should be about 200 degrees. That's when you know it's done. So if it's looking pretty dark, it's most likely done. But if you wanted to be sure, you could take the temperature at 200 degrees. You don't have to do that. So when you put your bread back in the oven for 15 minutes, just keep an eye on it. Look for a nice golden brown consistency. And it's okay if the ears get a little dark. You know, those are sticking out from the rest of the bread. So those are gonna get a little darker than the other part of the loaf, but that's okay, and that's actually adds some really nice flavor. So let's put this back in the oven for 15 minutes. All right, so here's the final product. As you can see, it looks beautiful. We have a nice belly that formed, a very nice ear and crust. I'm gonna use my oven mitts to pick this up. You'll want to remove it from the Dutch oven once it's done baking, because this is very hot and you don't want it to burn the bottom. But if you look at this, on the side here, there are some nice little bubbles that have formed on the crust. And one thing I've noticed is that when you're using rice flour, those bubbles oftentimes will not show up. People will use rice flour to do the ornamental scoring or just bread art or bread designs. You've seen me do it before in my YouTube shorts, where I'll cover the surface with rice flour and then make a design. That seems to prevent these bubbles from showing up. So it's kind of a trade-off. I mean, it's not like the bubbles add any extra flavor or anything, and they just look cool. But this is now the hardest part. So here's the bottom of the loaf. And just to hold it up to the camera, this is still very hot. Now, this is going to continue baking on its own out of the oven for at least another 30 minutes. And so the reason I said this is the hardest part is because I'm sure, like me, you want to just cut right into this and start eating it. But it's very important to let it rest. And I promise you, when you let it rest, it will still be warm on the inside, and still warm enough to melt butter or whatever else you want to put on there. And it will be just as delicious. And depending upon the type of flour you use, you may need to let it rest for a long time. So if you look at a lot of rye bread recipes, when you're using rye grain, you'll have to let that rest after you bake it for, 6 to 24 hours. And And the same goes for this stuff. You want to let it rest and develop even more flavor. So typically I'll let it rest for 1 hour. That will help the inside crumb fully develop. After an hour, we'll cut into it and see what the crumb looks like, and I'll talk a little bit about what you should look for in your crumb. All right, so we made it. It was a lot of fun. I hope you learned something from me. I would love to hear from you on how this went for you, any troubles you encountered, any successes. You know, comment in this post, tag me in a picture. You can find me on Instagram or YouTube, and I'd love to know how it went for you. I want to cut open one of these loaves to look at the crumb and talk about that a little bit. You can tell a lot by the crumb of a loaf of bread. It can sometimes tell you what you need to do next time you make a loaf to improve on it. So this one I'm not going to cut open. This just came out of the oven like 20 minutes ago. And actually I'm sharing that with a family member, so I'm not going to cut that one open. But this is the one that we made together. And I'm gonna cut it open and look at the crumb. When you're looking at the crumb, it's what a lot of people use to grade how they did on their bake. And so regardless of what it looks like, it's going to taste amazing. And I hope that no matter what it looks like for you, whether it's perfect or there's room for improvement, I hope you really enjoyed the process, and I hope you can make some amazing sandwiches, toast, other things with your sourdough bread and really enjoy it, because you worked hard to get to this point. So don't feel discouraged if it didn't turn out how you wanted to. You just got to keep trying and trying again. The nice thing about baking is that even when you fail, it still tastes amazing. Unless you forget the salt. That does not taste good. So let's cut this open and see how we did. I don't typically cut bread open sitting down, but let's see how I do here. All right, so here's the crumb, and what we're looking for is nice, even size holes, evenly distributed around the loaf of bread. And so we do see that here. We have some along the bottom and around the top. Some of them are smaller, some of them are bigger, but overall there's nice even distribution, which means that we did a pretty decent job with proofing our bread and the timing of our fermentation. Another thing you want to look at is the shape of the loaf. This one has a nice belly or shape with 2 ears. That's another good sign of good fermentation and proofing. If you have a loaf that's flat, that means you might have overproofed that a bit. If you have a loaf that, you know, flattened out in the oven and it doesn't have that nice curve up top, that means that it may have spent too much time in bulk fermentation or in proofing in your fridge, and that's something you could adjust next time. If you have a situation where you have huge pockets of space and not much stuff anywhere else, you know, just a couple really huge pockets, that's a sign that it was underproofed or under-fermented, and that you need to invest a little more time in the process and making sure that gets thoroughly fermented and evenly fermented too. So you want to make sure that you are spending time doing your stretch and folds, and of course at the stage where we're integrating the sourdough starter in with the salt, make sure you spend enough time in that area as well. Another thing that can happen sometimes is really dense bread. So you might have a decent shape, but the bread might look really gummy or dense. And that's another sign of under fermentation or under proofing, is you want to spend more time in that section. So this one is pretty good. It's got nice even fermentation throughout. It's got a nice shape to it. It's not dense, it's very soft. So no matter what it turns out, it's gonna taste amazing. So don't be discouraged if there's room for improvement, especially if it's your first loaf. So I hope you learned something from this. I would love to hear from you, like I said. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. I have a lot more stuff coming out, more recipes. I'll have some videos on adding inclusions like cranberries or chocolate, all sorts of fun stuff like that. And I'll have some videos on scoring sourdough bread or making cool designs. And then I'm also going to have a series on how to reuse bread that's going stale. During this video, if you liked any of the gear that you saw me using and you want to check it out for yourself, I'll put a link in the description and in my bio for you to check that out. All right, happy baking, everyone.